The morning air carries the scent of damp stone and horse dung, but in the Tower of London, the silence is almost devotional. Just beyond the barred windows, the Thames rolls cold and black. Oblivious to the woman who is kneeling in prayer just before sunrise, her breath is shallow, calculated. Her neck, graceful porcelain, is the subject of fascination across a continent. 2 years ago, it wore a crown. Today, it awaits a French blade. She wears a gown of gray damask, modest and without jewels. Her long dark hair is pinned beneath a linen coif. And though she's known for her wit, for her sharpness of tongue and cunning in court, today she speaks in whispers. To her ladies, to her God, to the silence she has not seen her daughter. She has not embraced her brother. Her own uncle will witness the beheading. History will tell you Anne Boleyn was a seductress, a schemer, a woman undone by ambition. But history was written by the men who needed her gone. Today, we strip away the legend and drag into the light a story soaked in fear, betrayal, and state-sanctioned cruelty. For what truly happened to Anne Boleyn was not a clean execution. It was a political murder wrapped in velvet and scripture, and the blade that ended her life, it did not fall upon a guilty woman, but upon an inconvenient queen. She arrived with foreign polish and English blood, a woman shaped not by softness, but by exile. The corridors of the Tudor court did not welcome Anne Boleyn. They measured her, weighed her voice, watched the sharpness of her eyes. In a world dressed in crimson and gold, her presence was not ornamental. It was disruptive. She did not flutter. She did not beg. She listened. Every hem trailing across the palace floors spoke secrets. Every glance from a nobleman was an opportunity. Every silence between queens and kings was a space to fill, carefully, precisely, with just enough charm to haunt without touching, enough wit to unsettle but not wound. Anne moved through the court like smoke, not invisible but untouchable. Henry noticed her. Of course he did. He noticed every woman. But Anne denied him, not to repel, but to bait. She withheld what others gave freely. She turned her body into myth. Her refusal made him ravenous. His lust, once casual and easy, became obsession. Yet Anne did not want to be mistress. She had seen what became of them: discarded bodies, emptied names. She would be queen, or she would be nothing. And for that, she would teach the king to wait. She would stretch months into years, flirtation into torment. And the court watched. They laughed behind their sleeves, then began to whisper. Her French ways, her dark eyes, her sharp tongue. They called her a whore in letters and a sorceress in poems. She smiled through it, as if the names did not stick to her skin. But she felt them. Oh, she felt them. And still she rose. Catherine of Aragon. The king's wife was aging. Her womb had closed like a fist. The line needed a son. The church said no, but Henry said yes. And Anne, eyes forward, never flinched as kingdoms twisted themselves into knots to make her ascent seem holy. When she finally stood crowned beside him, wearing white ermine and a smile that did not reach her eyes, the people booed. Rotten fruit splattered stone. She bowed her head and bore it. The hatred of a nation, the scorn of a continent, because she knew what it had cost to stand in velvet. But nothing is given without the hunger to take it back. The courtiers, who once bowed to her, now watched with sharpened grins. Old friends grew quiet. New ones grew close. The air in the palace changed. What had once smelled of lavender and roast meat now reeked of sweat, wax, and something colder, the scent of power withdrawing. Anne's charm, once intoxicating, turned shrill to the king's ears. Her cleverness grated. Her presence, once addictive, began to itch. And when she gave him a daughter instead of a son, the wolves began to circle, The same courtiers who had cheered her rise now exchanged glances across feast tables, wondering how many steps it would take to erase her. She had stepped beyond her place. She had flown too close. She had made herself seen, and in this court, visibility was a sin. Anne sensed it. She began to speak too much, beg too often, cry where once she had smiled. She wrote letters with trembling hands. She watched the king's silences stretch longer. She learned how absence could scream louder than words. In her chambers, the mirrors no longer reflected victory, only exhaustion. Her hands grew cold even by the fire. The servants curtsied with eyes downcast. No one called her queen unless required. Power is never a throne. It is a moment. And Anne's had passed, but still she stood tall. Still she painted. Her mouth. Still she walked among them, as though the walls were not narrowing, as though the eyes upon her did not already picture her head on a block. Anne Boleyn did not fall. She was unfastened, loosened by whispers, undone by hunger, and served to the dogs by the very men who once kissed her ring, and in the end, all the court would remember was how quickly they turned. It began in the quiet of her chamber, beneath sheets still stained with the sweat of childbirth. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. There was no celebration, no cannon fire, no parade of noblemen to kiss her ring. Only the cries of an infant girl, healthy, strong, but wrong. Anne stared at her daughter's face as if willing it to change, to morph into the angular certainty of a son. But Elizabeth was not what they had waited for, not what Henry had broken the world to obtain, not what Anne had risked damnation to deliver. In the dim light, her body felt like a husk, emptied, dismissed. The afterbirth had barely passed when the judgment began. Her womb had once been a kingdom. Now it was a liability. The same courtiers who had bowed before her growing belly now turned their gaze elsewhere. They no longer watched with hope, but with calculation. For if a queen could not make a prince, what was she? A failed spell, a misfired weapon, a stain on God's favor. Anne did not speak of the pain in her abdomen, the sleeplessness, the blood. She forced herself into court again days too soon, her gait slow, her colors faded. The king did not rise when she entered. His eyes flicked, toward her, then away, like someone watching a curtain flutter in the wind, waiting to see if it would fall. She tried again and again. Each month bled like a warning knell. The ladies whispered. She walked past them like a ghost in silks, pretending not to notice the way their hands tightened over their rosaries. Her pregnancies became national events. Her miscarriages became public failures. Then came the child, lost in winter, a boy, almost whole. He slipped from her body like a secret, wrapped in clotted linen. They burned the cloth. They buried the name. Anne screamed in the hours after, not from pain, but from knowing. She felt the betrayal, not in her back or hips, but in the cold click of the latch on the chamber door as it closed behind the midwife. Slowly, as if sealing a tomb, the king did not visit. He prayed with Jane Seymour. Anne, once flame, now flickered. Rumors bloomed like mold in the cracks of the court. Perhaps she was cursed. Perhaps she was barren. Perhaps the child was a demon, a punishment, a sign. The same men who had built altars to her beauty now drafted plans for her removal. Whispers shaped themselves into doctrine. Old words returned with venom. Concubine, temptress, witch. She had risen unnaturally, and what rises unnaturally must fall with divine force. Anne's own body had betrayed her, but it was not just blood that marked her downfall. It was the silence, the absence of royal touch, the absence of Henry's voice in her chamber, the slow erasure of favors, fewer dresses, smaller jewels, invitations that never came. Her name spoken with care, or not at all. She wore red once, hoping it would remind him of lust, of battle, of the promise of sons. He looked at her gown and said nothing. He turned his back before the dance began and still prayed. She still held Elizabeth close, but even her daughter was now viewed as a mark of failure. She began to hear it in the servants' steps, careful, distant, pitying. They spoke to her in soft tones, as one does to a woman already dying, and yet she did not break. She adjusted, smiled tighter, sat straighter. But even strength becomes dangerous when a woman is falling. A quiet queen might be pitied. A proud one, she must be destroyed. The phrase came quietly, then louder. Annulment. She heard it from her uncle, from a bishop, from her own ladies-in-waiting, who lowered their eyes as if that might hide their betrayal, and stood at her mirror, brushing her hair until her scalp ached. She pulled it taut, as if trying to reshape the image of herself, to find the girl who had once enchanted a king. But the mirror gave nothing back except a face stretched thin, lips chapped, eyes always scanning for danger. She touched her belly, flat now, with the memory of loss curled like a second spine within her. She had given him a daughter. But the court did not want daughters, and Henry wanted peace, and began to understand. Her fall would not be loud. It would come in parchment, in prayer, in policy. A slow, sacred unraveling, and all they would need to justify it was her womb. The ink dried before the blade was ever lifted. It began not with swords, but with silence. A silence too deliberate, too symmetrical, the kind that arrives just before the trap shuts. And sensed it in the air. The laughter at court became brittle, too rehearsed. Courtiers passed her with the hollow faces of men who knew something and feared it might cling to them. Her allies began to vanish, one by one, like birds in a poisoned forest. First, the poets, then the gentlemen of her privy chamber, then men she had once smiled at, touched lightly on the sleeve, allowed into her orbit. Some were summoned and never returned. Others reappeared looking older, thinner, with their eyes dipped in something cold and irreversible. Behind it all moved Thomas. Cromwell, the architect with ink-stained hands, the man who had once helped build her crown. He had kissed her ring, called her my lady. But now he whispered with the king behind chapel doors, his voice soft, his timing precise. He moved through the corridors like a shadow trained to wear boots, and did not fear him at first. That was her mistake. She believed her fall would be slow. But Cromwell was not a man of gradual descent. He favored collapse, sudden, public, irreversible. The charges came like plague smoke, unseen, choking, impossible to cleanse. Adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king's life. The accusations were not meant to convince. They were meant to stain. One name after another was dragged into the mud. Henry Norris, Mark Smeaton, Francis Weston, William Brereton. And then her brother George. She had grown up with George, shared secrets beneath stone arches, danced beside him at court, trusted him with the pieces of herself no one else could hold. And now they said he had shared her bed. That she had. Corrupted his blood and his soul. The men were taken, interrogated, beaten, promised mercy if they confessed, and horror if they did not. Mark Smeaton, the musician, broke first. His body couldn't hold its silence. He gave them what they wanted, a signature beneath a lie. That was all they needed. Anne was arrested during Mass. Her hands were folded in prayer when they touched her shoulder. She turned without crying out. Only her jaw moved, clenched, tight, unwilling to bend. They brought her to the Tower, not as a queen, but as an accused. She passed the same gate through which she had once arrived in glory. Trumpets had greeted her then. Now, only wind and the hollow thud of boots on wet stone. Inside her cell, the walls smelled of lime and iron. She could not sleep. Her body trembled. With the absence of truth, she knew the charges were fantasy, but fantasy was all the court needed. Fantasy dressed in protocol. Lies pinned beneath seals. Cromwell had built something too precise to fall apart. Anne paced in small circles. She spoke to no one for hours. Then suddenly, she would talk too much. To her ladies, to herself, to the God who had once made her. Queen, she asked if Elizabeth would be safe, if her name would survive, if any of this would be remembered. She heard the trial preparations through the walls, the echo of names being read aloud, the scribble of pen against parchment. She heard George's voice, defiant even now. He mocked them. He named their hypocrisy. But defiance meant nothing in that place. It was a performance, and the ending had already been written. Anne was not stupid. She knew this was not justice. It was ritual, a blood-cleansing masquerade, and she was to be the centerpiece. She stared at her hands and wondered how they had built something that could be dismantled so easily. She had thought her intelligence would shield her, her wit, her alliances. But men like Cromwell did not fear minds. They feared women who remembered. Each name they accused her with was a blade, not for the act, but for the suggestion. A queen, they said, who could not birth a son might birth betrayal. A woman who could not be silent must be filthy. And a king who had broken the world to marry her must be shown a reason to regret it. Anne curled in the cold and whispered the names they had taken from her, one by one, like prayers for the already condemned. By the end, even her innocence felt like a kind of guilt, and the knives they held, they smiled while they sharpened them. The hall smelled of sweat and polished wood. Not incense, not justice, just men, their breath thick with meat and wine, their robes stiff with ceremonial velvet, crimson against the ash-gray walls. Sunlight filtered through high windows, but even the light felt selective, avoiding her where she stood. Anne Boleyn entered with her hands folded, not shackled, but bound by something colder. Her chin was high, her spine unbroken, but her eyes, they no longer searched for rescue. They saw the shape of the end now, and the men who would walk her there. The air did not move. They had placed her on a platform, a raised mockery of her once elevated station. The same voices that once sang for her coronation now spoke her charges in slow, deliberate venom, treason, adultery, incest. She listened without blinking, as if the weight of the words had already been measured and accepted. She did not cry. She did not plead. Her silence was not consent, but survival. The jurors, lords and noblemen, were not there to consider. They were there to nod. Some avoided her gaze. One or two held it too long, as if trying to apologize with their eyes. But Anne knew better. Pity was not justice, and justice had never worn this many rings. She answered the accusations with composure, with logic, with memory. She reminded them of time, of sequence, of the impossibilities of flesh. She dissected the lies without theatrics, cutting them down with the blade of reason. But truth is not the currency of power. She had lost the coin that mattered most, the king's favor, and nothing else could purchase her freedom. Outside, the crows gathered. Inside, her brother sat just paces from her, accused beside her. George, who had once recited poetry, at her side. George, who now faced death with a half-smile, knowing his words would change nothing. They tried to shame him with books, with verses. Said he had read poetry too freely, spoken too tenderly. They made literature into sin, made affection into filth. Anne's breath caught only once, when they accused her of mocking the king's manhood. It was not the lie that wounded, but the pettiness, that a crown could be defended by gossip. that a life could be taken to avenge a bruised ego. The hall was packed, but no one moved. Time stretched like wax over flame. Every word spoken felt, rehearsed, and in truth, it was. The verdict had been whispered days before. Cromwell had prepared it like a feast, and now the lords came only to eat. When the sentence was read aloud, Anne did not flinch. Death by burning had been floated. Then the axe, then a sword from France. A courtesy, they said, a mercy. As if the choice of blade could redeem the theater, she bowed her head once. No one touched her. No one wept. Her ladies watched from the edge, hands clasped, faces pale and unreadable. To mourn too openly was to risk joining her. They led her away, not as a traitor, but as a prize already claimed. The corridor echoed with the scrape of heels on stone. Anne did not look back. She knew the court would exhale once she was gone, knew they would pour wine, murmur about decorum, and marvel at how regal she had looked, even in disgrace. That night, in her chamber, she sat by the window and stared at the Tower Green. She did not eat. She barely moved. The wind was bitter through the cracks in the wall, but she did not cover herself. She whispered to no one, only to herself. Over and over, the same words, I am not guilty. But in that place and in that time, innocence was not armor. It was invitation, and the sentence had not fallen on her soul, only her body. She heard it in whispers before she saw it written. The swordsman from Calais, a foreigner summoned in secret, paid in coin and silence. His blade, curved and silent, was said to be cleaner than the axe. They called it mercy, but Anne knew. Better, there was no mercy in premeditation, no dignity in dressing a ritual of blood in velvet. The sword was not kindness, it was theater, a refinement meant to polish the spectacle, not dull its cruelty. They wanted a clean corpse, not a splattered mess. The Frenchman's blade was sharper, yes, but it was still meant to sever her from herself. She was given 2 extra days. They said the executioner had not yet arrived. They said the delay was necessary. She knew it was worse than cruelty. It was calculation. A queen's death must be timed for maximum obedience. They gave her hours not to reflect, but to decay slowly from within. Each morning, she woke unsure if it would be her last. Each night, she lay down in the same gown, lips murmuring prayers into linen. Her breath left shadows on the cold stone walls. Her body, once perfumed and draped in silks, now wore only the scent of dust and dwindling sleep. She confessed to nothing. There was nothing to confess, but she forgave. One by one she forgave. Them, her uncle, the jurors, Jane Seymour, even Henry, not because they deserved it, but because it was the last thing she could still choose. On the morning, they told her it would be that day. She nodded. Not a tear, not a tremble, just the tightening of her fingers in her lap. She dressed slowly. A gray gown, the color of overcast sky. No jewels, no embroidery. Her dark hair pinned beneath a simple coif. No crown, no fanfare. Just the hush of her steps and the shiver of cloth brushing stone. She asked for one final mass. The priest's voice cracked as he spoke the Latin. She did not weep, only closed her eyes when he offered the bread, as if tasting something she might still take with her. When they came for her, she smiled, not with joy, but with that same poised defiance she had carried for years. The one that made men nervous, the one that made kings jealous, the one that had cost her everything. The tower yard was damp with morning dew. The grass still held the echo of footsteps. Guards, carpenters, clergy, all moving like ghosts before the procession. The scaffold was wooden, stark, without drape. Her coffin they had placed nearby, a plain arrow chest, too small for a queen, just large enough for a problem solved, she mounted the steps without help. No drumbeat, no choir, just breath and the rustle of onlookers pretending not to stare. She turned to the crowd, spoke clearly. Sighed she died the king's faithful servant. Said she wished no ill upon those who had condemned her. Her voice never faltered. Only her hands moved, briefly, clasping, then unclasping. Like someone testing the edge of belief, the executioner stood behind her. She did not look at him. She had requested he be summoned early to rehearse the strike. He had hidden the sword in straw. It was a kindness, they said, as if not seeing the thing that would end you made its coming gentler. She knelt on the scaffold. No block, just the open air. Her fingers dug slightly into the wooden planks, not out of fear, but to remain still. To hold her dignity in place, she began to pray aloud, "Jesu, receive my soul." And again, "Jesu, receive my soul." The swordsman called for his assistant to fetch his sword. A ruse, they later said, to distract her. As she turned her head slightly in confusion, the blade swept, a single motion. They said it was clean. They said she did not suffer, but they always say that. The head rolled a short distance, hair dark and tangled. The lips still moved, a reflex perhaps, or something older, deeper. Blood pooled, and the yard fell silent. Not for grief, but for protocol. It was over. The Frenchman was paid. The body carried away in haste, laid in that arrow chest without ceremony. The crowd dispersed like fog beneath the sun, and Anne, woman, queen, heretic mother, was no longer spoken of aloud. The sword had done its work, but it had not killed her name. The grass where her blood had soaked was raked clean by mid-morning. Straw scattered, then swept. The boards dismantled, wiped of splinters and sin. The air still tasted of iron, but no one spoke of it. Not in the kitchens, not in the halls. Not in the private chambers where men signed marriage treaties and women stitched silence into linen. Her body, warm only moments before, was lowered into a rough arrow chest meant for storing weapons. No shroud, no ceremony. Her hair was still damp. Her eyes never closed. The lid shut with a hollow thud, and in that sound echoed a kingdom pretending not to remember her shape. By sunset, the tower's flag changed color. By the week's end, the king had moved on. He wore white for mourning, then gold for marriage. 11 days, that was all. 11 days between death and replacement, between the blade and the veil. Jane Seymour was quieter, paler, easier to look at, easier to forget with. The court adjusted like a snake shedding skin. Same body, different. Shine. Anne's name was scraped from ledgers. Her emblems burned from tapestries. Even her daughter, Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate. A royal child turned bastard by ink and decree, but blood doesn't vanish when it dries. It thickens in the cracks. Anne's daughter would grow up in shadows, half seen, half spoken. A girl too sharp-eyed, too self-possessed. She would inherit. No mother's arms, no lullabies, no crown. Only the whisper that her mother had once dared to be more than what was permitted. And paid for it, they called Anne a whore, a seductress, a traitor, but Elizabeth remembered her as flame. Across the realm, the churches bore new altars, the papal chains broken. The crown now godless in form, but more divine in power. Henry had cut the church to have Anne, and now, with her body, rotting in unblessed soil, the scar remained. The schism did not heal. The prayers changed languages. The priests changed loyalties. But the wound stayed open. Anne was gone, but the fracture she left behind deepened and deepened. Cromwell, once triumphant, would follow her to death a few years later. His head also taken, his loyalty outlived. The same hands that built her Ruin could not steady their own ladder. Even Jane Seymour would die giving birth. The son she bore would not live to rule. The tower never emptied. The scaffold never slept. History tried to soften her, made her a victim or a villain, depending on the century. They painted her pale, passive, pliant. They dulled her voice into silence, or sharpened it into sin. But neither was true. She was not gentle. She was not wicked. She was simply seen, and that was unforgivable. No myth survives without silence, and no truth survives without pain. Anne's truth was not in her trial, or her gowns, or her crown. It lived in the breath she gave to defiance, in the choice to rise again and again, even as the court turned cold. It lived in her refusal to be merely ornament, to love power not from a distance, but from within its jaws. The scaffold did not end her. It exposed them, every smile that fed her rise, every prayer that sanctioned her fall, every hand that pushed while pretending to catch. They could burn her name, marry her husband to another, lock her daughter in forgotten wings of palaces. But Anne Boleyn had cracked the mask of royalty. She had looked the king in the eye and said no. She had kissed her child and said, "Remember," and the blood she spilled on Tower Green, it still speaks, not loudly, not for pity, but for reckoning and the silence around her. That was never peace, it was shame.